Joseph is a special person in the Bible and Quran, for he connects the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Canaan to Moses in Egypt, in addition to his contributions to the foundations of religion. The book of Genesis and the Quran told us that Joseph was the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons and Rachel's firstborn, and told us how Joseph was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers and rose to become the second most powerful man in Egypt next to the Hyksos Pharaoh. The man in the caravan who bought Joseph from his brothers was called Malik, according to the Quran. The slave master who bought him in Egypt was called Potiphar in the Bible and Aziz in the Quran. His wife was called the wife by the Bible and Selika according to Quran commentators. The man was working as a bodyguard for the Hyksos Pharaoh. Joseph soon became the new young and physically attractive homeboy. He did not go unnoticed by Aziz's wife, who was a social and sensual lady. Yusuf, according to the story, had a strong desire for his temptress, the dangerous and seductive housewife. A relationship had developed quickly between the two, as both the Bible and the Quran confirmed. In one episode, Lady Zalika had invited her mature women friends to see her new homeboy. They were excited to see the young man, and one of the ladies was taken by his charm and noticing that she cut herself by the knife in her hand while peeling a fruit. One woman asked Lady Salika, "And what if he refuses to do what you want?" The wife replied, "He's my slave and will do as I say, or I'll send him to the dungeon." In another episode, Lady Salika asked Joseph to follow her to her bedroom. They conversed over relationships and religions. Joseph told her that he was afraid to love his stepmother Balha, who was caught making it with his brother Reuben. He loved his aunt Leah and the way she was dressed, and once she accused him of stealing her belt. Moreover, the love of his father to him landed him in slavery. The alluring wife tried to persuade him to forget the past and live the moment. Joseph sat on the side of her bed, listening to her seductive, mature approach. She softly touched him and slowly took his clothes off. But suddenly, the front door was opened, and the bodyguard husband appeared at the door. Joseph peeled himself off the hands of his lady, running out of the bedroom, while leaving his shirt in the wife's hands. When she saw her husband Aziz, she cried, pretending that Joseph tried to rape her. She repeated the story through her tears. Aziz became angry at Joseph, who neither denied nor confirmed the accusation. He sent him to the dungeon, guarded by his servants, who probably were jealous of Joseph also. Joseph was thrown in jail, and his feet hurt in irons, according to the Bible. The imprisonment of Joseph lasted for 13 long years. He, however, adjusted to the life in an Egyptian jail, claiming his innocence. But most prisoners claim innocence. He kept himself intrigued, interpreting the dreams of other prisoners. His life took a turn when he met in jail two prisoners. One was a baker and the second was a butler for the Hyksos Pharaoh of Egypt. Both were accused of poisoning the Pharaoh's food. Joseph learned that they were in jail awaiting an investigation to decide their fate. The two men had nightmares, worried about their fate. Joseph volunteered to explain their dreams and comfort them. He told the butler that he would be released soon and be restored to his old job, while the fate of the baker was clouded. Sure enough, on the Hyksos Pharaoh's birthday, the butler was restored to his old job and the baker was convicted. 2 years had passed, and one day a guard of the Pharaoh appeared at the jail to ask for Joseph. The Pharaoh needed someone to interpret his dream. He was troubled with his recurring dream about 7 fat cows that were swallowed up by 7 lean cows. The butler told his Pharaoh about his acquaintance of a prisoner called Joseph, the son of Jacob, 2 years ago, who excelled in dream interpretations. The Pharaoh sent for Joseph and related his dreams to him. Joseph told the Pharaoh that there would be 7 years of great plenty in the land, followed by 7 years of famine. He also suggested storing grain to avoid the famine. Joseph had neither previous economic educations nor a track record and experience in economics, except he had economic sense to know about the economic cycle that repeats itself every 5 to 7 years. The Hyksos Pharaoh ordered the release of Joseph for his rendered services. The Pharaoh, no doubt, knew the story of Joseph, for he was the homeboy of his bodyguard Aziz and his wife, Lady Salika. Joseph was 30 years old, and he landed an important job in the court of the Hyksos king, an economic advisor and in charge of grain storage. He fitted perfectly in his new position, for he was a Canaanite, and the whole Pharaoh court and elite were of Canaanite, Palestinian, and Syrian origins. Joseph found support in his work because of the structure of the ruling government and his Hyksos elite. In the south, there was another Egyptian pharaoh who was building an army and spreading a destructive propaganda against the aliens in the north who occupied and colonized Egypt. They were, however, of a lesser influence. The Hyksos pharaoh gave Joseph a new Egyptian name, Zephanath Paneah, for the Egyptians have been peculiar about the names of foreign rulers. The pharaoh also arranged for Joseph to have a wife, Asenath, a daughter of a priest of On. It is clearly Joseph was at ease with Egyptian and Canaanite religions to marry a daughter of a priest. Joseph initiated a policy of taxing the farmers at 20% of their income from grain. The particles were stored in government storehouses. Joseph and his wife had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. They lived as Egyptians and part of the court of the Pharaoh. Years of drought crept on the people, and the economic growth diminished, and supplies of grain ran out in the market. Joseph, with the approval of his government, sold the stored grain to the people for a fair price to prevent irrational increase in prices. Joseph also implemented a trading grain for farm animals, which he also put in special areas for his pharaoh. These economic policies enraged the opposing government in the south, which accused the alien Hyksos of starving and enslaving the Egyptian people. Similar weather conditions in Egypt were the same in the surrounding areas. The land of Canaan had suffered more in famine times, for it lacks a fertilized river valley that kept agriculture supplies available at all times. Shepherds in dry climates and desert areas suffered the most. Jacob and his family were also experiencing the drought. He gathered his 10 older children and encouraged them to buy grain from Egypt, for the prices of grain in Canaan were exuberantly high. 10 Bedouin men arrived to the delta of Egypt. They were dressed in an oriental attire similar to that of the south, riding donkeys, and spoke a dialect close to that of the south, were asking questions about warehouses of grain, made Egyptian agents suspicious of them. The Egyptian security men of the north followed them, suspecting them to be spies to the government in southern Egypt, which was waging a war of propaganda against the Hyksos Pharaoh and his government. The Egyptian security did not accept the claim of the Bedouins that they came from the land of Canaan to buy grain, and they were placed in jail until verifications. Joseph, as a grain master, was informed of the claim of the men. He investigated the imprisonment of the 10 men to recognize, surprisingly, his 10 brothers. He, in full compliance with his government rules, talked to them through a dialect interpreter. He went along with his security and bureaucrats and kept them in jail. After 3 days, Joseph decided, as a government official, to meet the 10 men and investigate their request to buy grain. Grain purchase and storage were within his jurisdictions. The Bedouin continued to tell the story that they were shepherds who came from the land of Canaan to buy grain. Joseph recognized his 10 brothers, but was not able to go against the spying allegations. Shepherds and Bedouins were routinely recruited to collect military information in the Middle East. They reported army movements and building of warehouses while being in the open grazing their animals. The brothers told their story, correcting each other. Reuben chided the others by telling them that he had warned them not to do ill to Joseph, and now they were paying for the evil they did to him. Joseph realized that his brothers had lived through guilt for selling him, and Simon was no doubt the ringleader in the evil that was done to him. He listened to their case and finally issued them a permit to buy grain and keep a violent and tempered Simon as a prisoner until they verify their story and bring their child brother Benjamin to Egypt to show their innocence of spying. The 9 brothers loaded their donkeys with sacks of grain and drove back to the land of Canaan in distress over the imprisonment of their brother. The journey back to Krayat Arba from Memphis took 2 weeks to cross 250 miles of desert roads. One brother discovered that the price he paid was inserted into his sack of grain. They reached their village and they were received by their father Jacob and the rest of the family. They told about their trip to Egypt, which brought sacks of grain and money that resulted in the imprisonment of their brother Simon. As they unloaded the grain, they found that each man's money had been inserted in his sack. This caused even more fear and confusion. Jacob was concerned with taking Benjamin to Egypt. He blamed his returning sons of appearing suspicious. And what if they go back to Egypt with Benjamin? They might be charged with theft of the money. No final decision was taken by Jacob while Simon was in Egyptian jail. When they had used up the supply of food they brought from Egypt, Jacob agreed to send them back to Egypt with Benjamin to buy more grain and release their brother from prison. Joseph saw his brothers came back with 20-year-old Benjamin, his little brother. He knew that the brothers had taken care of him. He went above the security and the bureaucracy of the state to approach the head of the pyramid to ask for forgiveness and release for the Canaanite men. They were not spies after all. The Pharaoh was pleased and his entire court as well. Pharaoh asked Joseph to bring his father and sons to be shepherds for the kingdom in the land of Goshen. Simon was released from jail, and Joseph invited the Bedouin men to join his party for dinner. When Joseph entered the dining room with his company, the brothers bowed down before him, thanking him for the release of Simon, and presented gifts to him. Joseph inquired casually about their welfare and that of their father, and if that was their little brother Benjamin. He then gave orders for the meal to be served. When the brothers were ready to leave, Joseph commanded his steward to give them as much grain as they would carry, to return the money in their sacks, and to put his silver cup in Benjamin's sack. Happily, they were on their way, rejoicing, when a servant accused the brothers in stealing Joseph's silver cup. This was no ordinary cup, for it was called a cup of divination to predict the future. The cup complemented Joseph's dreams and his court position. The brothers fell in confusion and distress and pleaded their innocence. A servant found the silver cup in Benjamin's sack. Benjamin, who was taken away by the security guards, and the brothers were ushered out. They went back to their father, who asked them to go back to the kind man, to Joseph's house, to plead with him for the life of Benjamin. The brothers defended the innocence of Benjamin, but to no avail. Judah talked in behalf of his brothers, telling Joseph about their misery in leaving Benjamin behind, which may destroy his old man who was still grieving over his son Yusuf. Joseph was following the story of Judah when he began crying and sobbing to hear about the grief of his disappearing had caused. Then Joseph spoke in his old childish Canaanite slang. "Hey, it is me, Joseph." Joseph saw a shock and fear in his brothers' faces. He asked about the health of his father and then invited the brothers to come to his house. Joseph told his brothers that it was God who inspired them to sell him into slavery so he could become their master and their star and preserve their lives. He instructed them to return to the land of Canaan and tell his father Israel, "Your son Joseph, ruler over Egypt." He told them that the Pharaoh agreed to assign them the area of Goshen, 900 square miles of fertile land to graze the cattle for the Pharaoh. The brothers recognized their brother Joseph, indeed, for he was the same dreamer who became now an authority in Egypt. Was this really the kid they had sold into slavery? Joseph wanted them to believe that it was God who had planned everything, even when their intentions were not right. Benjamin entered the room to join the reunion. The other brothers hugged each other in disbelief. Joseph gave his brothers new clothes to wear as Egyptians now, for they are related to him, gifts to take back to their father, and plenty of grains to carry back to Canaan. Jacob was told that his sons were coming back with Simon and their donkeys loaded with sacks of grain. The Koran quoted him as saying, "I smell the scent of Joseph with you." They told him that his son Joseph was still alive and sent gifts to him, and that all these grains loads were free from him. They gave the father a shirt from Joseph, and he recovered his sight, according to the Quran. Israel agreed at once to leave to Egypt to be united with his beloved son. But how could they leave behind all that they had worked for all these years? Bedouin belongings are in fact very basic and little. Israel and his whole family loaded up their belongings on back of animals and carts and started out their way to Egypt, passing by Beersheba and camped there for the night. Israel had a dream, and God appeared to him and assured him that going to Egypt was the right thing to do. So a caravan of 66 people plus their animals proceeded through the two deserts of the Negev and Sinai. Joseph, upon hearing the coming of his father, took his chariot and went to the border crossing to meet his family and facilitate their entry to the new country. When the family finally crossed the border, they embraced and were joyful in disbelief. Joseph knew that the shepherd trade was not so popular among the farmers of Egypt. Hiring his family was a good administration to his Pharaoh, who accumulated large herds from selling grains to the Egyptian farmers. As the famine continued, Egyptian farmers continued to barter their cattle, horses, and flocks for food. They watched their animals being taken away by Canaanite speaking shepherds. The life in Egypt was so hard during the famine that farmers offered their own land and children for food. Joseph bought most of the land of Delta of Egypt for the Hyksos Pharaoh, except the land that had been owned by the priests. The Pharaoh in the south charged that it was the scheme of the alien Hyksos to enslave the Egyptian people. Joseph continued with his policy grain for animals to keep his Pharaoh strong and his government rich and powerful with plenty of stores of food, farm animals, and strong army. Joseph capitulated on the farmers' land by barter. He kept the farmers to cultivate the land, giving the grain seeds, but give back 80% of their produce to the government. The land was owned by the Pharaoh, and his army can move any farmers who did not pay his share of the harvest. That policy became the foundation for the feudalist system that spread afterward. Israel and his family, meanwhile, multiplied and prospered in the land of Egypt over the next 17 years. At the age of 147, Israel knew that his life was coming to an end. By then, he realized that despite the prosperous life in Egypt, there were lots of misery and misfortune. He knew that the Egyptians hated them as Canaanites, accusing them of exploitations. Already, the propaganda was surging in the south with calls to liberate Egypt from the alien Hyksos and their lackeys out of their country. Their propaganda claimed that the Canaanites had a religion originated in the underworld. Archaeologists had discovered scripts of such propaganda to describe the Hyksos elements as children born as a result of intercourse between devils and jinnis. أولاد عفاريت أمهم جنية, as the Egyptians still say to people who are hated by them. Israel called Joseph to come and see him, and he told him that he was going to die soon. Obvious Joseph was occupied by his job and position. He brought his wife and two children to see his aged blind father, who asked him to carry him back and bury him in the land of Canaan next to his father Isaac and his mother Rebekah, Rivkah, grandfather Abraham, and next to his wife Leah. The other brothers came to see their great young brother and dying father. Israel mustered some strength and sat up on the edge of the bed. He repeated to them that they should go back to the land of Canaan sooner than later. On his deathbed, Jacob cursed his uncontrolled strength and rejected his birthright. He said, "The years of my stay on earth added up to 130 years. Few and unhappy my years have been." The children listened to passionately to their father's last testimony before he went in a coma and died. They mourned their old father and prepared his funeral to bury him as he requested. The brothers returned back to the land of Goshen in Egypt to continue their life and work. Joseph lived to see his grandchildren witnessing great changes in his kingdom. In the year 1575, the Hyksos were defeated by the rising Pharaoh in the south and were driven out of Egypt, and Joseph and his relatives did not leave with them. During the collapse of the Hyksos Pharaoh, Joseph would have been 55 years old. According to Genesis, he lived to be 110 years old. He lived another 55 years under the new Egyptian government, losing his job and prestige. Joseph apparently lived separate from his family, but after retired from his government job, shared in reciting the history of his family. He knew his family was at an awkward position, for the Egyptians looked at them as foreigners who settled in the region of Goshen in the Nile Delta, and they proliferated and prospered under the Hyksos regime. Egyptians were envy of their prosperity. The Israelites were identified with the Hyksos Pharaoh and were known to be a foreign group that secluded itself from the rest of the population. With Joseph's retirement and his disappointment in politics, the Israelites rejected their identification with the Canaanite elite, and they were as critical of them as the new rulers of Egypt. Egyptian propaganda continued to condemn the Hyksos shepherd kings as alien, and their religions patronized prostitutions in their temples. Egyptian pharaohs of city-states were at a propaganda war with the Hyksos pharaohs before and after the collapse of the Hyksos Canaanite rule. The brothers, during Joseph's legacy, were working for the state, so the new state had to find new jobs for them. Gradually, the descendants of Israel were moved out of the land of Goshen and hired in different construction jobs and were pressed into forced labor. The Israelites asked Joseph to interfere as the new Pharaoh on their behalf, and the Bible says that the Pharaoh did not know him. The Bible described that now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Joseph knew how the Pharaoh's bureaucracy worked, and it was hard to reverse a public decision of the Pharaoh. He also worked for a Hyksos king who was sympathetic to the Israelites as Canaanites, and now the new Egyptian Pharaoh was against the Hyksos and Canaanites altogether. Joseph told his relatives, according to the Bible, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place." Joseph was 110 years old when he died. His brother insisted to embalm him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. When Moses was preparing to leave Egypt, he took the bones of Joseph with him during the Exodus. The bones of Joseph were buried in what became Joseph's tomb, a funerary monument located at the eastern entrance to the valley that separates Mounts Gerizim and Ebal, 325 yards northwest of Jacob's Well, on the outskirts of the West Bank city of Nablus, near Tel Balata, the site of biblical Shechem. Biblical tradition identified the general area of Shechem as the resting place of the biblical patriarch Joseph, the eponymous ancestor of the northern kingdom of Israel, and his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Joseph's tomb has been venerated throughout the ages by Jews, Samaritans, Christians, and Muslims. Post-biblical records regarding the location at the site from the beginning of the 4th century AD. The present structure, a small rectangular room with a cenotaph, dates from 1868 and is devoid of any trace of ancient building materials. While some scholars still affirm the essential historicity of the biblical account of Joseph, many others argue that the story itself has no basis in fact. Modern scholars has yet to determine whether or not the present cenotaph is to be identified with the ancient biblical gravesite. No Jews or Christian sources prior to the 5th century mention the tomb, and the structure originally erected over it appears to have been built by the Samaritans, for whom it was probably a sacred site. After Israel captured the West Bank in 1967, Muslims were prohibited from worship at the shrine, and it was gradually turned into a Jewish prayer room. Interreligious frictions and conflict from competing Jewish and Muslim claims over the tomb became frequent. Falling under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian National Authority (PNA) following the signing of the Oslo Accord, it remained under the Israeli Defense Forces guard, with Muslims prohibited from praying there. At the beginning of Al-Aqsa Intifada in 2000, just after being handed over to the PNA, to the Palestine National Authority, it was looted and razed. Following the reoccupation of Nablus during Israel Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, Jewish groups returned there intermittently. Recently, the structure has been refurbished with a new cupola installed, and visits by Jewish worshippers have resumed.